So, if you're thinking about launching a podcast, you already know that it's a pretty saturated market out there right now. Who doesn't have a podcast? However, the good news is that there are still plenty of audiences out there and listeners who say, yeah, we're kind of overwhelmed by how much is out there, but we think there's still a lot of room for somebody to be different and for somebody to be better and for somebody to go deeper on a specific topic. So, what I want to do for you today is help you kind of plan and consider and take some specific steps towards creating that very first podcast so that you can hit the ground running, make a good first impression. You don't have to learn some of those really tough lessons along the way. And part of it's because I learned those lessons back in 2011 and they still apply today. So let's jump right in and think about what we need to consider up front before we even start thinking about production. The first thing we need to consider is our topic, obviously. And I know people say things like, make sure you're passionate about it, which is absolutely true because that's going to come through. Make sure that it's something that people are going to want to listen to. That's one thing that brands get into trouble with is they come up with this thing that's tied to their business and they see it as a sales tool. And then when they produce it, it sounds like a sales tool and that turns off listeners. And then they realize, wait a minute, if I was on their side, I wouldn't want to listen to this either because that's not why I listen to podcasts. But what we have to do is we have to come up with something that is of interest to a listener. Why is somebody going to want to listen? And better yet, if you are about to create a podcast and you know there are other podcasts out there like yours, then you need to take that next level and think, what can I do to be different that's going to make like a power listener, a listener who's out there listening to 10, 15, 20 podcasts, they listen to multiple shows a day and you now have to convince them, why am I going to add your show into my listening routines? Do you want to think about, okay, if I come up with a topic, is this topic going to create things to talk about year after year? I mean, really what you should be doing is thinking about doing a podcast that's going to come out consistently, either every week or every other week, so people can plan for it. They know you're going to be there every Tuesday or every other Tuesday or whatever day you pick. If you're going to be every week, you're probably going to need to figure out a topic that's going to be able to produce maybe 45 shows, give or take a year. And then obviously half that if you do every other week. And that's a problem I see people run into is they come up with this really cool idea as to what they're going to do their podcast over. And then by episode 16, they're like, what else do we talk about? So another thing to consider in all of this is what are you going to do regarding your format? Because format is really a key way that you can differentiate yourself. A lot of people are going to generally say, well, I'll do an interview podcast. And that's a great idea, if you've got quality people to talk to. But then you have to really think about bigger questions about how can you provide better interviews? And there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can fine tune your interview skills. You can edit those interviews in a unique way to where you're not just another interview show. The other thing you can do is just think of other ways to create content that doesn't involve an interview. Maybe you have that conversation with that thought leader, but then you come back and you create just really unique content. Maybe you add some sound design to it, some sound effects and music, or you create a format that has chapters. Here's part 1 of what we're talking about, part 2, part 3, or any number of other ways. And maybe you record the conversation and you put drops in from all these different conversations. Maybe you've had with multiple people. Or maybe you just open it with a highlight from something somebody said, and that's your topic, and you talk about the topic, and you fine tune that on-air presence so that people are engaged in what you're saying, and you find other ways to break that up. But if you can create a unique format that's different from everybody else, that's going to be a huge advantage to you to not do the format that generally everybody else does in your space. If you're in a business space, I mean, how many times do you hear the same type of intro? They welcome you to the show. They might read a lot of stuff about themselves, which is not a good idea. And then they'll say how excited they are to have this person on their show. They talk, they ask generic questions that the listeners heard other people ask, and then the show's over. This is about thinking about new ways to come up with a format or at least approach to the show where you can stand out and you're immediately answering that question that we asked earlier. which is what? It's like, if I'm going to fit you into my listening routine, what have you done to convince me that I need to fit you in? Go ahead and give that first episode you create a listen, but listen as a listener. Don't listen as the person who created the show. Put yourself in your listener's shoes, or maybe their ears and their mind. Find out if you zoned out or not. Or if anything, say, okay, if I'm in my audience's shoes, why would I come back and listen again? What did I get out of that? The first podcast I ever did, I did that. I listened to it and honestly could not answer the question other than to say, I don't know. I don't know why I would come back. I don't know what I got out of that. So it made me kind of retool the show. And there's a way we can address that early without having you release that show ahead of time. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about after you have finished the format. The next thing you're obviously going to do, now that you have kind of a topic or a theme and you kind of know what approach you're going to take, now you need a title. And I want to tell you how important this is. Titles really require a lot of work sometimes. And the reason being is because I can't tell you how many times I've seen people pick a title and it's not real clear what it's about, or I thought it was this based on the title. And then I look at the description or I hear the first episode and they don't align. But here's the other thing. I've seen people create titles to podcasts, and then I find 6 other podcasts with the exact same title. And sometimes they're related and sometimes they're not. So one of the best things you can do as you develop your title is after you come up with it, search for it on Google, or better yet, use ChatGPT and say, are there any other podcasts out there with this name? And even if you find somebody, let's say you find a couple, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's disqualified. What I would do is I would go back and see if they're still producing shows, because I've named podcasts before and I have found somebody who used the same title, but they made 3 episodes and quit 6 years ago. And so in that case, it doesn't matter. Don't get so clever and creative where, your creative brain says, love it. And then your listener looks at that and goes, I don't know what that is, and just moves on. So make it clear. And then obviously you can really reinforce that with your show's description and all this. And when you develop that title, obviously one of the things you're going to need to do is create a logo. Now let's talk about the logo for a minute. I remember going to a podcast conference not that long ago, and they were talking about budgeting. And I'm not saying you should do this. Really, the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because it shows you how important the logo is. They said, if you have a $500 budget for your podcast, right, then what you should do is spend $450 on the logo. That's what they said. Now, this was back before there were so many tools out there to make a logo. You can create one in Canva. In fact, you can take a template and make one of your own. You can hire somebody on Fiverr or Upwork to do the logo for you. One of the things I've seen other podcast experts like Daniel J. Lewis say when it comes to doing that on Fiverr is just make darn sure they're creating kind of an original artwork for you, because he's seen instances where these people are just looking to make a quick buck. And what they do is they just take something and use an image that they don't own and you don't own and say, here's your logo. They just put your name on it. Just make sure you're getting original artwork if you have somebody do that for you. Here's the other thing to remember. When you start creating the title in your logo, make sure that you can read it even when it's really, really small. Because think about those times when you're searching for podcast, maybe it's on Apple or maybe it's just on your phone. What happens? It's a much smaller square. Sometimes what people will do is they're building it out on Canva, and it's taking up the whole screen. And then they put all these words on it and they don't realize that when Apple or some of these other platforms shrink it, shrink it down really, really small to like the size that Apple does, you can see whether or not, even at small sizes, I can still read the title of your podcast. 2 things we need to consider: how we're going to sound to the listener right out of the gate. And then the other thing we need to discuss is whether we should even publish that first episode. Okay. So here is something incredibly important. All right. And I'll be honest with you. I do not understand how this problem happens today, but I bet if you listen to podcasts, how many times have you heard a show that starts like this?
This is the Podcast Example Podcast with your host, Jim Miller.
Welcome to the podcast, one and all. I am Jim Miller, your host today on the show, and we're talking about the Oxford comma, so buckle up. I still hear this all the time, especially in business podcasts. There's no excuse for this anymore. I'm sorry. There just isn't. And I really don't understand why people don't care. There are plenty of good microphones, high quality microphones, including the very first one I ever got. The very first microphone I ever bought, I actually found it at Target, but now you can find it on Amazon. It's called the Samson Q2U microphone. It sounds great, and it's a good starter mic, especially if you're not sure if this is even something you want to continue doing, but you want to give it a go, and you don't want to spend $350 on a mic. Find something like that. But this is so jarring to a listener, and it's just inexcusable, because think about this. What were we talking about before? We were talking about power listeners, and we were talking about how many podcasts are out there, and we were talking about how people are saying they need things that sound better. That's the other challenge with so many shows being created, which is also your opportunity, is there are plenty of shows that sound just like that because someone's just half-assing it. And they just figure, okay, well, I'll just use this little mic that's built into my computer or this other mic instead of going all out. And it's like they don't care that they're jarring you with that poor quality after hearing such a high quality open. And first impressions are everything. They're going to give you a few seconds to see if you're worth listening to. And the first impression you're going to give is going to be quality. And so there's nothing like being let down by that high quality open, followed by that poor quality introduction, where it sounds like someone's on a Fisher-Price toy microphone or a muffled microphone, or they're in a closet or something. Don't do that. You are already harming yourself right out of the gate. Go out there and produce a good high quality open. Go ahead and get yourself a good mic that's going to make you sound at least comparable to that high quality open. Okay. Finally, to kind of wrap all this together, my first podcast ever, I didn't really know what I was going to be able to accomplish. So I had kind of this, well, I'll try this and see what happens sort of thing. And then my show by episode 7 sounded so different. I had made so many dramatically good changes and tweaks from those first 5 episodes. I looked at that 7th episode and I said, I want this to be my first episode. I really, if I had someone land on my page and go, oh, I'll just check out episode 1. I don't want them to hear episode 1. I want them to start with episode 7. And what was the only way I could do that? I had to delete the first 6 episodes of the show, which there were some good things in it. And I hated doing that, but I had no choice. I had to go that route. And what happened after that? I kid you not. I go to a podcast conference, I think a few weeks later, and I get into this session, and the guy's like, something I recommend all podcasters do, and this is what I'm passing on to you, so you don't make this mistake like I did. Go ahead and make those first few episodes and don't release them, because it's likely, as you go back and listen to them as a listener, not as the producer or the host of the show, as a listener, where you're trying to gauge, is this engaging? Is this good? Do I like that? Could I have done that better? Stuff like that. You're going to make changes. You're going to tweak it. And they literally said, your 6th or 7th episode will probably sound a lot different from your first. And that's going to be the one you're probably going to want people to hear. Maybe for you, it might be episode 4 that you're proudest of, and you want that to be the first one you release to the public, where you do listen to that episode and you say, okay, what did I get out of that? If I'm a listener, what did I get out of that? If I listen to this for the first time, would I come back to get more, and why? And if you can answer that question, then you've probably got a really good thing going for your podcast. And by the way, when I say, do that first, you're not tweaking later, that doesn't mean that you never should tweak or learn something new or try something new or never try to improve anything. Yes, you should. I am still doing that to this day, and I started back in 2011. So by all means, continue to think of new things, hone your craft, all that stuff. I'm just talking about maximizing your chances of getting out there, doing some of the right things first. And really, of course, what we're trying to do more than anything here is make a good first impression.